Let me ask you, if you have your Bible, to turn to Daniel chapter 11. Today we'll be spending our time in the last two chapters of the book of Daniel. We started at the beginning of this year to look at this Old Testament major prophet book. I hope that it has been an encouragement to you as it has been to me, as we've been looking at the pages, chapters, and verses that have gone before. We have a huge chunk to cover today, so we will not read it all in one go, but we will read it in chunks. Daniel chapter 11, and we'll spend our time in Daniel chapter 11 and 12. What do you learn from history? What lessons can you draw from history? These are the questions that historians ponder upon. It is doubtless that there are countless lessons in history. There is demonstrations of things that you should do and things that you should definitely not do. However, English historian and philosopher Aldous Huxley says that, quote, that men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important lesson of all in history. What is the most important lesson in history? That men do not learn very much from history. Now, we do not want to be like those that Mr. Huxley here describes. We want to be good students of history. We want to be those who draw the right lessons so that we may live lives that are pleasing to the Lord. So the book of Daniel is interesting because even though it is a prophetic book, it is also a historic book. As we saw between chapter 1 and 6, history is recorded. Daniel just tells us what transpired during his time in exile. However, starting from chapter 7, the prophecies begin. But as we've been seeing, these prophecies that Daniel was looking forward to, they constitute history that we look back towards. Therefore, this book helps us with an opportunity to learn from history. And what do we see when we look at history? We see that the wicked run in futility. Secondly, that the wise stand in faithfulness. And lastly, that God drives history towards their victory. The wicked run in futility, the wise stand in faithfulness, and God drives history toward the victory of the wise. So firstly, notice the wicked run in futility. Turn your attention to Daniel chapter 11 from verse 2. I'll read to verse 20. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. And when he has become strong, through his riches he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the authority with which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up and go to others besides these. Then the king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he and shall rule, and his authority shall be great authority. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his arm shall not endure. But she shall be given up, and her attendants, he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. And from a branch, from her roots, one shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. He shall also carry off to Egypt their gods with their metal images and their precious vessels of silver and gold. And for some years he shall refrain from attacking the king of the north. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the king of the south, but shall return to his own land. His sons shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall keep coming and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north. And he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. For the king of the north shall again raise a multitude greater than the first. And after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times, many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision, but they shall fail. Then the king of the north shall come and throw up siege works and take a well-fortified city. And the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. And he shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his hand. He shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom, and he shall bring terms of an agreement and perform them. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom, but it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Afterward he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them, but a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back upon him. Then he shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land, but he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. As I mentioned last week, our text picks up from the words of Daniel chapter 10 verse 1, where Daniel in the third year of King Cyrus the Persian sees a vision. After Daniel received this vision, he gets an angelic interpreter who comes to him in another vision. This second vision is what we see narrated in chapter 10. As we saw, before God shows and explains to Daniel what he is to do over the next several hundred years, God slows everything down in order to encourage his servant, in order to prepare his servant for what he's about to hear. He shows him a true picture of reality, shows him that there is a God in heaven who is sovereignly revealing himself and who fights for his people. So now when we come to chapter 11 and 12, we are seeing a callback to Daniel chapter 10 verse 1. This is that vision that we saw there. The vision opens with 3 more kings of Persia after the current one in verse 2. 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and then there shall be a 4th. This is likely Xerxes, the husband to Queen Esther. Then a mighty king arises who is not a king of Persia in verse 4. Undoubtedly, this is referring to Alexander the Great, who in one fell swoop conquered most of the known world at that time. However, at the young age of about 32, he dies of illness. But his kingdom does not fall to an heir in his bloodline. Instead, it was divided between 4 of his generals, the the kingdom of the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucid Empire, the kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor, and Macedon. And now, don't need to remember all those kingdoms, particularly for this text, Just need to remember two. The Egyptian kingdom of the Ptolemies, which is pronounced with a P that starts. It's Ptolemy, but it's pronounced as Ptolemy. And the Seleucid Empire, which is referred to as the kingdom in the south. Sorry, the kingdom in the north. So the Egyptian kingdom is the kingdom in the south, and the Seleucid kingdom is the kingdom in the north. All right? These are the two kingdoms that become the main focus of the next 15 verses from verse 5 to 20. Now, time would fail us to look at each of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids and the Antiochuses, not to mention the women, the Berenices and the Cleopatras, who all feature in these verses. I would encourage you that if you are keen to find a reputable history of that period that will give you a detailed retelling of these events. And by this I don't mean a Netflix series. I mean like an actual book that tells this is history that is well documented. One of the amazing things that will strike you is how God is on the dime with each detailing of what will happen hundreds of years before it happens. Marriages and betrothals and assassinations and betrayals, all of them will happen on God's timetable as shown in these verses. Suffice it to say that these verses cover decades and centuries of maneuverings, wars, betrayals, assassinations, betrothals that lead to betrayals and assassinations, treachery, deception. And yet, there's something that this text is begging us to notice. It wants us to notice the futility of all this kingly activity. The futility of all this kingly activity. What is the word that appears most frequently between verses 4 and 20? Now, some of you might have seen that we are going to look at this text on Friday, and you are like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to try to find the most common word that shows up here, because repetition shows emphasis. Well, here it is. The word is but. B-U-T. In these 15 verses, this word shows up it shows up 13 times. I was marking them on my Bible, and I actually wondered, have I missed one? And I kept finding one that I had missed on careful rereading. In verse 4, verse 5, verse 6 twice, verse 9, verse 11, verse 12, verse 14, verse 16, verse 17, verse 18, verse 19, and verse 20. Let's look at them one by one. Verse 4. And as soon as he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the four winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, not according to the authority with which he had. Verse 5. The king of the south shall be strong, but one of his princes shall be stronger than he. Verse 6. After some years, they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south shall come to the king of the north to make an agreement. This is the daughter Berenice of one of the Ptolemies, who was given as a token of an alliance, but who was later assassinated, which is covered in this. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and his arm shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, and he who fathered her, and he who supported her in those times. This plan to have an alliance between the two kingdoms, with the southern kingdom seeking to weaken the northern kingdom through marriage, will fail. Verse 9. Then the latter shall come into the realm of the kingdom of the south, but shall return to his own land. He shall come to attack, but his plan shall fail. Verse 11. Then the king of the south shall be moved with rage, shall come out and fight against the king of the north, and he shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. Verse 12. And when the multitude is taken away, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail. Verse 14. In those times, many shall rise against the king of the south, and the violent among your own people shall lift themselves up in order to fulfill the vision. But they shall fail. That is, people among the Jews who shall ally themselves with these kings as a way of getting power, as a way of amassing power. But they shall also fail together with that king. Verse 15 into 16. And the forces of the south shall not stand, or even his best troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. But he who comes against him shall do as he wills, and none shall stand before him. Verse 17. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy the kingdom. This is the telling of the story of the northern kingdom's king, giving his daughter Cleopatra to the king of Egypt, so that he can weaken that kingdom. However, Cleopatra goes and falls in love with her king and everything, with her husband and everything Egyptian, and actually strengthens the kingdom against her own people. And so this is covered in verse 17. But it shall not stand or be to his advantage. Going on to verse 18, afterward he shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall capture many of them. But our commander shall put an end to his insolence. Verse 19, then he shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land. But he shall stumble and fall and shall not be found. And finally, verse 20, and there's more buts actually as you continue with the text. But let's just stop here. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute for the glory of the kingdom. But within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. But. Daniel had seen this in his 80-something years. He had seen the king of Judea taken captive. He had seen Nebuchadnezzar rise and fall and die. He had seen Belshazzar and spoken to him on the night when he was killed. He had seen kingdoms rising and falling. He had seen the kingdom of Judah and he had seen the kingdom of Babylon, and now he is seeing the kingdom of Persia. But even he, together with the people of Israel, needed to be reminded of this. You see, there's something in our human hearts that inevitably draws us to either trust or fear those in power as if they are sovereign. Power gives an unmistakable sense of permanence. Power says to us, I'll never be moved. I'll not be shaken. I will not be removed. I am here forever. Zoea, he. Mimi ndo niko. And many other phrases that we've come up with. But David, for example, himself a king, reminds us in Psalm chapter 146, put not your trust in princes, in a son of man in whom there is no salvation. When his breath departs, he returns to the earth. On that very day, his plans perish. Blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob, whose hope is in the Lord, his God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, who keeps faith forever. The word forever can only be used on the God of Jacob. For all the plans and schemes of these kings, they are time-bound and they are transient. They are frail and fickle. They are weak and wobbly. Their plans achieve nothing. Their schemes are always come up empty. Do you see how much activity is there in these verses? How much is happening? People are moving things. People are getting things done. Balance of power keeps shifting, but it never truly comes to a rest. None of them is able to establish a lasting peace. None of them is able to finally sit on his throne and go, it is done. Whenever they think they have achieved something, there is something waiting for them on the horizon, and it is that 3-letter word, but. Therefore, friends, do not invest all your hopes and ambitions in man, no matter how powerful or permanent they may seem. We often feel as if everything comes down to the next person who's in power, to the next person who has the wheels and the steering wheel of power in his hands. What happens in the next election? Let me ask you, friend, who right now is the most imposing figure in your life? Either because you fully trust them, you go like, this is the kind of person, this is where I will put, this is the basket that I'll put all my eggs in. Or, maybe it's not trust, maybe it's someone that you fear. A good way to know that is, who influences the actions and decisions that you make? Who are you mindful of? Who do you have on your shoulder, sort of looking at what you are doing? Is it a man? Is it a human being? Friend, let me invite you to this thought experiment and put that person alongside these mighty kings. One way to make that experiment really is ask yourself, can this person raise an army? Chances are probably not, I'm guessing. That's as objective a measure as possible. Often it's because this person determines how happy I am, this person determines whether I'll keep my job, and so on and so forth. So place them next to this person, to these kings. And then notice that these mightier kings fade away, wax and wane. But don't stop there. Now put that person who's most imposing in your life next to God. And see how it's like placing a firefly next to a billion sun. Friends, should never convince ourselves that our lives are ultimately in the hands of a man. Secondly, notice that this knowledge will help the wise to stand in faithfulness. The wise stand in faithfulness. We now come to verse 21, and I'll read all the way to verse 35. Then shall arise in his place one who shall, verse 21. In his place shall arise a contemptible person, to whom royal majesty has not been given. He shall come in without warning and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken, even the prince of the covenant. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, and he shall become strong with a small people. Without warning, he shall come into the richest parts of the province, and he shall do what neither his fathers nor his fathers' fathers have done, scattering among them plunder, spoil, and goods. He shall devise plans against strongholds, but only for a time. And he shall stir up his power and his heart against the king of the south with a great army. And the king of the south shall wage war with an exceedingly great and mighty army. But he shall not stand, for plots shall be devised against him. Even those who eat his food shall break him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. And as for the two kings, their hearts shall be bent on doing evil. They shall speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for the end is yet to be at the time appointed. And he shall return to his land with great wealth, but his heart shall be set against the holy covenant, and he shall work his will and return to his own land. At the time appointed, he shall return and come into the south, but it shall not be this time as it was before. For the ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the holy covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the holy covenant. Forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offerings, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. He shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant. But the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And the wise among the people shall make many understand. Though for some days they shall stumble by sword and flame, by captivity and plunder. When they stumble, they shall receive a little help, and many shall join themselves to them in flattery. And some of the wise shall stumble so that they may be refined, purified, and made white until the time of the end, for it still awaits the appointed time. This brings us to the reign of the northern king, Antiochus IV. Though the previous 15, 16 verses in this chapter have covered roughly 300 years, the next section covers only 11 years. This is something that the book of Daniel does often. Things move fast and then they slow down. And they particularly slow down when the history being described has the most to do with the people of God. And this king of the north, Antiochus IV, or as we saw, as we spent quite some time in chapter 8 to look at him, named himself Antiochus Epiphanes, interacted with God's people in all the most cruel of ways. Antiochus is particularly focused on because of the effect that his rule had on the people of God. We see in this figure an embodiment of hate against God and his people. Notice the deception that he is known by. Notice the exaltation that he achieves and the persecution that he brings. The deception, exaltation, and persecution. Notice first of all the deception that characterizes him. Verse 21 shows us that he is not a natural heir to the throne, but he obtains the kingdom through flatteries. We know that he was in prison and then he was released when he learned that the kingdom of the north had a vacant throne. The person who was the king was an infant at that time, his infant nephew. When he went, he sort of ruled as a steward of the kingdom for a while, and then when his nephew reached the age of 5, he mysteriously died. That's all we're going to say. Let the reader understand. Verse 23 tells us pretty plainly that he acts deceitfully. He is called, in verse 21, the contemptible person. That his methods are contemptible. They are to be despised, to be looked down upon. Verse 32 tells us that he seduces with flattery those who violate the covenant, meaning that he will seduce the people of God away from their covenant with God so that they may be unfaithful to God and faithful to him. So we see here in deception a king who is like the serpent of Genesis chapter 3, who is willing to lie for power. And to a great degree he succeeds. That's why we'll notice next the exaltation that he achieves. Verse 21 to 22 tells us that he obtains the kingdom and armies shall be utterly swept away before him and broken. Verse 23b, notice, tells us that he shall become strong with a small people. That because of his deceptions and flatteries, he will not need a large army, but only a few people to rise to power. Verse 24 tells us that he shall devise plans against strongholds. Finally, and most relevantly, notice the persecution that he brings against God's people. Go again back to verse 22. I forgot to tell you, but this is someone where just good to have your Bible open at all times. And if we move too fast, you can just note them down on your notebook and go look at these sections later in the afternoon. Verse 22, he breaks the prince of the covenant. This likely refers to the high priest, Onias, whom Antiochus IV deposed and replaced him with someone else who had bribed him for the post. After his victory against Ptolemy VI, which is captured in between verse 25 and 27, we are told that he set his heart against the Holy Covenant, referring to God and his people. Because he is proud after the victory that he has just enacted against the kingdom of the south, he wants the next thing, which was the kingdom of Israel, which at that time was under the rule of the Southern Empire. And so he wants to go and get it and put it under his rule. He sets his sight against God's people, God's land, and God himself. In verse 29, we see Antiochus seeking to invade Egypt once again, but this time he is stopped. We're told of these ships of Kittim, which many commentators believe to mean the Roman Empire intervened and brought to him. We have this in the history books that he was brought an edict from the Roman Senate, which demanded from him a halt from attacking Egypt. Rome were the big boys in town now. And they decided who invades who. In fact, we're told how Antiochus tried to flatter and kind of deceive himself out of this situation. But the Roman general who came to deliver the edict took a stick and drew a circle around him and told him, I need your decision before you step out of the circle. And he had to make a decision, and he agreed not to attack Egypt. But what effect does that have on God's people? He is enraged. Look at verse 30. He shall turn back. Verse 30. For ships of Kittim shall come against him, and he shall be afraid and withdraw, and shall turn back and be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay attention to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. In enraged frustration, he shall invade Israel and commit the actions described in verse 30 to 32. He shall seek first to flatter and deceive those who would easily give up the covenant and seek to align with him. But then he would also come with much rage and persecution against God's people. Verse 31, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular and burnt offerings. We are told about this horrible, cruel king who comes to Jerusalem in the 160s AD, BC. And he strips the people of God of any sacrament. He says that any parent who has a circumcised male infant will be killed. Anyone who offers sacrifice to any god apart from Zeus will be killed. Anyone who observes the Sabbath shall be sentenced to death. Anyone who is caught with a scroll of the Torah will be killed. As one commentator puts it, in his reign of terror, it seemed the only chance was to either be a live pagan or a dead Israelite. Therefore, many in Israel caved. This severity of suffering and persecution is what God intends to prepare his people for. My friends, just pause there and remember what we said in chapter 8, that our God is a kind of God who promises his people suffering. That far from being a deceptive person, like a deceptive politician who makes promises that they cannot fulfill, or just us in our lying tongues and our exaggerating mouths, how we often make promises that we cannot fulfill, God intends for his people to know that they shall suffer. And he intends for them to know that they shall suffer under cruel judges and kings sometimes. This is why Peter tells us that the first thing that should go out of the window when we meet suffering is surprise. Do not be surprised when you encounter trials. Why? Because your God has promised you this. He has called you to this. But there are those among the people of God who will stand in the face of this unspeakable suffering. Why? We're told in verse 32, it's because they know their God. The people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. Several things are said about these wise people. We're told that they know their God. They know that He is good and wise and sovereign. Therefore, they do not cave in the midst of flatteries or persecutions. Secondly, that they shall make other people understand. Because they know their God, they shall particularly use this time of suffering to make others know about their God. Being wise, they shall beget others who are wise. Thirdly, we're told that they shall stumble. This does not mean that they will compromise, but rather, like we saw in verse 19, stumbling here means great suffering, even death. But in the midst of this cruel pain, we're told that they will stumble. This is what God calls the suffering of His people. That when they go through great pain, because of the glory that is awaiting them, it only looks like a tiny stumble. Fourthly, even though they stumble, they will be refined, purified, and made white. God will continue to sovereignly pursue His purpose of purifying His people through their suffering. Friends, what does this tell us? It tells you and me as Christians that the greatest danger that you and I face in life is not suffering. Hear that. The greatest danger you face is not suffering. The greatest threat in your life is not suffering, but compromise. The win, the victory that the flesh, the world, and the devil are pursuing in your life is not to make you feel pain. The devil's role in your life is not to make you feel pain. The devil's plan with Job was not to just make him suffer. He is a purposeful sadist. He's not just a sadist. He seeks to, through the pain, make us give up on our God. The greatest win, victory that he pursues is to use that pain to make us compromise. And yet, friend, what this chapter tells you, as it has been piling king after king after king, cruelty after cruelty after cruelty, might after might after might, to present this ultimate persecutor of God's people. What it is telling you is that even then, even in the midst of your toughest suffering, it is still possible by God's grace to be purified by your suffering and not polluted by it. It is possible to be refined by hardship and not ruined by it. It is possible to be whitened with joy in adversity and not darkened by resentment in it. First Peter reminds us in chapter 1, verse 6 to 8, in all this you greatly rejoice, though now for a little while you may have had to suffer grief in all kinds of trials. These have come so that the proven genuineness of your faith, which is of greater worth than gold, which perishes even though refined by fire, may result in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Friends, your suffering is not proof that God is not active in your life. Your suffering is the proof that God is active in your life. That He is actively refining your faith. In what ways, friend, are you tempted to compromise today? It may feel as if there's no other way except compromise. Yet Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would tell us that there is singing in the fiery furnace. Daniel would tell us that there is sleep in the lion's den. That there is possibility, by God's grace, to trust God in the midst of suffering. Finally, notice that God drives all of history toward the victory of the wise. God drives all history toward the victory of the wise. Verse 36 to the end. And the king shall do as he wills, He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. He shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. A God whom his fathers did not know he shall honor with gold and silver, with precious stones and costly gifts. He shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Those who acknowledge him he shall lord with honor. He shall make them rulers over many and shall divide the land for a price. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen, and with many ships. And he shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom and Moab and the main part of the Ammonites. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and of silver, and all the precious things of Egypt, and of the Libyans, and the Cushites shall follow in his train. But news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation till that time. But at that time, your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above, and those who turn many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood on this bank of the stream, and one on that bank. And someone said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream, how long shall it be till the end of these wonders? And I heard the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever, that it will be for a time, times, and half a time. And that when the shattering of the people, of the power of the holy people comes to an end, all these things would be finished. I heard, but I did not understand. Then I said, O my Lord, what shall be the outcome of these things? He said, go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves and make themselves white and be refined, but the wicked shall act wickedly. And none of the wicked shall understand, but those who are wise shall understand. And from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away from the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. But go your way till the end, and you shall rest, and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of days. God drives history toward the victory of the wise. The Lord's hand is in control of all history to deliver a victory for his people. This section brings us to the more debated part of chapter 11. That is verse 36 to 45. And the section begs the question, who is the king that is talked about in verse 36? The history of Antiochus does not map well onto his description. And we seem to see the end of Antiochus Epiphanes in verse 35. The terms that are used to describe this figure also take on a cosmic tone, which seemingly go beyond the Middle East. this has caused diversion in views, with some seeing this as a continuation of a description of Antiochus IV, or Caesar Augustus, or an emperor of Rome, or another end-time Antiochus, like the figure that is described in the New Testament as the Antichrist. I'm convinced that there's a certain humility that we bring into this, partly because of what Daniel says in chapter 12, verse 8. I heard, but I did not understand. I read that part, and I was like, yep, Daniel, that's you at your most relatable. And so there's humility that we bring. However, I'm convinced that what the person described here is a kind of climactic figure who is envisioned as opposing God and his people at the end of history. However, in the same way that we see a great overlap between him and the other kings that have come before him, this is not just meant to be a singular ultimate figure in the future, but a description, kind of description of all rulers that oppose the rule of God. John tells us in 1 John chapter 4, verse 3, but every spirit that does not confess Jesus is from God, this is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard is coming. Even now, it is already in the world. It is coming, and is already here. Therefore, when we see the characteristics laid out here of this king, we're not just to look forward into the future or just look backwards in history, we're also to look around in the present day and see this king described in rebellious rule against God. What are the characteristics of this king? The primary one is blasphemy. This is clearly the spirit of the Antichrist. We're told that in verse 36, he will do as he pleases. This is this autonomous quest for self-rule that characterizes him. You can hear the echoes of Eden, where this is what the serpent sells to Adam and Eve. Eat it and rule yourselves. This is the quest of every sinful human heart. A quest for self-rule that is put on display and embodied through wicked rule in the world. He will speak, we're told, monstrous things or astonishing things against the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is finished. For that which is decreed will be done. He will show no regard for the gods of his fathers and desire for women. The idea there of desire for women is a puzzling one, but it might mean that this is someone who has no gentleness in him. That this is a man who is only committed to one thing, war and bloodshed. That he only seeks conquest. There will be an humanity about his rule, which lacks entirely that feminine aspect of the human nature, of gentleness and kindness and hospitality and warmth. His doctrine, as we're told in verse 38, might be called might makes right. He does not honor any god but the God of war, the God of fortresses, a God whom his fathers did not know. Now, when you hear those descriptions and it continues, I hope that several kings and rulers in history come to mind, and even in the present. I hope that your heart also comes to mind. For the Bible means to cut us on both sides of the sword. But this ruler, who will also be set against God and his people, look at verse 45. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. This is quite the descriptions that are there between verse 40 and verse 45. Time fails us, but you see why many would see this as a description of Caesar Augustus. That some of the places and some of the regions that he is described as going and fighting Some of the characteristics of even him dying without any help through the betrayal of others describe him. But this, as I've said, as I said as well in chapter 9, apocalyptic literature does this. It takes one ruler and multiplies him several times. There is a, as I said, transhistoric reality. There's a reality here in this king that transcends a particular person or particular period. And yet, in the midst of this great suffering of God's people, in the past, present, and future, in the spirit of the Antichrist, God will rescue his people. Even he will not last forever. This climactic king comes to an anticlimactic end. God will deliver his people. Chapter 12, verse 1, Michael, the great prince who has charge over his people, the archangel whose name means who is like God. It's a biblical reminder of God's concern for his people. It is at that very time when suffering is at its fiercest that God arises. The next verse shows us and catapults us all the way to the end of history where God's salvation for his people crescendos. The destination that God is driving his history to is where? It's the bodily resurrection at the end of history. At the end of history, God's people win. Those who sleep in the dust, we're told in verse 2, shall arise, shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to everlasting contempt. Oh, friends, this is where history is headed. History is not this cyclic thing that never has an end. It is not a river that goes and flows into the ocean of nothingness. No, it is headed to a particular destination, to a bodily resurrection where the true king and the true ruler of all the earth and the whole universe will judge every living man and woman. Even death will not spare those who are wicked from this judgment. Friend, are you here and you're not a Christian and you kind of hope for a bright future somehow? Friends, the God who has your future in his hands tells you this is what the future is. And this is what ultimately determines whether your future is bright or dark. But there's hope. Because the Son of God came and suffered under the cruel rule of the cruel kings of this world. During the powerful rule of Caesar Augustus, Jesus was born. Under the cruel rule of Pontius Pilate, Jesus was crucified. And under his rule, he rose again and he received all power, authority, and dominion. And friends, even right now, no matter who you feel has the strands of history in his hands, whether the US or China, whether the Kenyan military or Al-Shabaab, whether it is the person that you fear at work or at home, friends, the person who is ultimately in control is this Jesus. But he has enjoined himself to the people who believe in him. And just as he rose on the third day, his people who rose with him on that day spiritually will rise with him bodily on that last day. Christian, this is your great promise. This is what is meant to fuel your jets. This is what is meant to anchor your soul. This is what is meant to light up your horizon. This is what is meant to be the light at the end of your tunnel. Your bodily resurrection. Your eternal dwelling with God. Oh, do not despair. Do not compromise. Do not see your suffering as far outweighing the glory that is to come. For why? Those who are wise, those who know this God, shall shine like the brightness of the sky above. You know what I love about this? You remember chapter 10, right? What astonished Daniel that he fainted? The brightness of this angel. You guys remember, of course, right? It was just last week. Just encourage a preacher at You remember that, right? It sounds familiar. Yeah. Okay, good. Right? And look, you can even imagine, the angel is telling Daniel, basically you'll shine even brighter than I am. For this description is not even used to describe this angel. Those who live faithfully in dark times shall shine brightly on that last day. Friend, Christian, have you taken time to preach this to your heart? Members of Emmanuel Baptist Church, do we remind each other often of this hope? Do we act and live and speak as if our ultimate hope is not our next job or is not the next neighborhood that we will move to, but it is the ultimate bodily resurrection that Christ has secured for us? Friend, if you're here and you're a Christian and you have not joined a local church, do you notice the way that God speaks about his people collectively throughout? God does not just simply work on individual projects. He is seeing a people through whom through Christ he has saved. And he means for you, in the same way that you will shine bright with the fellow saints, to right now labor with them in their suffering. To right now with them make known the fame of Christ. So would you submit yourself to a local church? Would you seek to come alongside other Christians and encourage them in their suffering and labor with them in their lament? Why would you deny yourself that joy of fellow workers? And why would you deny others the joy of your encouragement? But what about Daniel? Verse 4, but you, Daniel, my version has a weird thing where it says, but you, Daniel, shut up. And then it ends there, and it goes to the next paragraph. Oh, shut up the words and seal the book. The meaning of this is that keep this safely. Make these be in a place that is available for many years to come. It's not hide this that the people of God may not know, but keep this so that the people of God may know in the midst of their suffering. And because of this, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Because God has spoken, his people shall look into his word, and knowledge of what God's plan is and what promises of God to his people are will be multiplied. Why? Why do we know this? It's because we know Amos speaks similar language, but about judgment. Amos chapter 8, verse 11 to 12. Don't go there, just write it down. Amos chapter 8, verse 11 to 12. Behold, days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will send a famine on the land, not a famine for bread or a thirst for water, but rather for hearing the words of the Lord. And the people will stagger from sea to sea, from north even to the east. They will go to and fro to seek the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. But in Daniel, because there are those who know their God, their knowledge will increase. This takes us back to what we saw in chapter 10, that our God wants his people who are in suffering to not think that he is silent. Friend, your God is actively speaking to you in his word, in your suffering. And so, Daniel asks, when will this happen? How long shall it be? We are not told a clear answer. Daniel is actually just told, verse 9, go your way, for the words are shut up and sealed for the time of the end. And verse 13, go your way till the end, and you shall rest and shall stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. Daniel had spent his life concerned for the people of God. Daniel had spent his life laboring in prayer for the people of God. His anxieties were for Jerusalem, as we keep seeing him praying and fasting. And he's told, you go on with your life. Continue being faithful, and you shall die, and one day you will rise. I.e., Daniel, you faithful servant of God, this is not even ultimately on you. Long after you've died, long after you've stopped praying, these things will continue to transpire. God will continue to be faithful to his people. And you will rise and stand in your allotted place. We open the book of Daniel with Daniel standing in his allotted place in Nebuchadnezzar's palace. We end the book with Daniel being told of another king in whose palace he shall stand on the last day. This is the hope that we have. Our God sovereignly drives everything. Do you see how many times our God reminds us of time? How these kings rise, but at the appointed time they fall. That these people are persecuted, but for an allotted time. That these things will go on for 1,290 days. That we should go all the way to 1,335 days. It's interesting how God often mentions the suffering of his people and time simultaneously. God mentions suffering. Even the text that we saw in 1 Peter, remember? Is suffering for our time. God does not want his people to think of their suffering without simultaneously hearing the tick, tick, tick of the clock. For our faith is like gold. Our God is the master craftsman. He will not let it stay in the furnace for a second too short or a second too long. But one day, the tick, tick, tick will stop. And God's people will enjoy glory forever. Friends, God has placed a timer on your suffering. And he's thrown away the clock for your glory. You will not be able to measure the amount of joy and delight that you have in his presence. You will not remember and wonder, was my suffering too long? You will not think that your suffering was a second or a day shorter or longer than it needed to be. For your God drives history to your victory. Let's pray. Our God, we praise you for your faithfulness. You're good, you're sovereign, and you're wise. We pray that you would convince us of these things even as we look at the elements, as we taste, eat, and drink them. Would we know that these promises are as real as the bread is to our tongue and teeth. That as truly as we can taste the cup, so real is Christ's present reign over every detail of our lives as individuals and corporately as your church. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.